So, about this theme of polarization, this was actually the theme of a conference called the Our Whole Society Conference, which happened in Waterloo in early May. And this conference really sought to understand why there are deepening divides across Canada happening on a number of social issues. And this conference really was a great success. I think not just saying this as a Canadian Interfaith Conversation board member, but really from the participants that really appreciated having the space to dialogue on different perspectives and also on what might be a spiritually based solution to polarization. So today I want to acknowledge the MPs that are part of the Interfaith Caucus that are here lending their support today. We have MP Elizabeth May, who was also the plenary speaker at the Our Whole Society Conference. We have MP Garnet Generous, who's here. We have MP Samir Zuberi, whose staff was very helpful in setting up the logistics behind this event today. And also MP Daniel Blakey, who unfortunately sends his regrets, though he was involved in shaping this event as well.
Would you mind if I acknowledge another MP in the room?
Yeah.
Our colleague Kelly Bach, who's not part of it, but it's so good to see Kelly.
Yes, welcome MP Block. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So to explain a bit of the agenda today, we'll have 3 speakers that will each speak to their experience with polarization, hoping to explain a bit about the landscape of polarization in Canada. Then we'll invite 3 of our MPs to come and respond. And after which we hope there'll be a time with the live stream. This event is being live streamed and will end sharply at 9 o'clock, though we hope that some of you will stay and have the opportunity to chat and also get to know each other as Ottawa-based faith communities. And so now I'd like to pass along the mic to the moderator for today, Akash Maharaj. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here this morning. Since we are on Parliament Hill, I suppose it's only right to acknowledge it's always a good sign of a well-organized political event when you choose a room that is just too small for the number of people who are going to attend to create a sense of enthusiasm and momentum. So thank you to the organizers for their prescience, and thank you to all of you for filling up the seats and then slightly a bit more. We'll be talking about the threat of polarization. So I should introduce myself. My name is Akash Maharaj. I'm a volunteer with the Canadian Interfaith Conversation. And we will be speaking about the threat of polarization to our society, as Andrea has mentioned, flowing on from our recent conference, our whole society conference that we held in Waterloo, Ontario. I don't think I need to say to everyone in this room that we as Canadians think of ourselves as an inclusive society. And we are a society that is based fundamentally on bringing together people from around the world who are greater together than we would be apart. And from that perspective, whereas polarization is an issue in every country of the world, in every democracy, and indeed in every non-democratic state of the world, it is a particular threat to societies like ourselves, where our populations are bound together not by a common race or language or ethnicity or a common set of historical accidents, but instead by a conviction that we are one people. We brought together a stellar panel of speakers today to talk about the rise of polarization in Canada and internationally, and more importantly still, what it is that we can do about it as Canadians to have a society that is both diverse and united. Our first speaker will be Amira El-Gawabi. She has been a journalist. Indeed, she spent 14 years with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and a human rights advocate. She was previously Director of Strategic Communications and Campaigns for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, but she is most notable today as Canada's Special Representative on Combating Islamophobia. Welcome.
Good morning, distinguished parliamentarians, Senator Cardozo, fellow guests, fellow presenters. I am deeply, deeply humbled to be joining you today on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples, where I am blessed to live. I want to give a sincere thanks to the Canadian Interfaith Conversation for inviting me to join you this morning to take part in such an important discussion. I'm grateful to share some thoughts with you related to how Islamophobia and hate are impacting our social fabric and have become core ingredients of polarization in this country. As you know, this is actually a heavy week for Canada's Muslim communities and for our friends, neighbors, and allies. I returned from London, Ontario yesterday, where the city marked 2 years since the worst mass killing in its history, a terrorist attack targeting Muslims, an act of hate, and a horrifying symbol of the dangers of polarization in our society, where the accused existed in his own distorted and extreme version of reality within which Muslims represented something to be feared, despised, and ultimately eliminated. Sadly, he has not been alone in such thinking. When the Quebec mosque shooter was asked why he had decided to walk into a place of worship and kill people indiscriminately, he told police that he was afraid that Muslims were going to kill his parents, him, and that, quote, he had to do something. Where did such ideas come from? Why were these two young men so consumed by fear of Muslims that they felt they had to take the actions that they did? Part of the answer lies in the construction of Muslims as other, and speaks directly to what it is we mean when we talk about Islamophobia, the definition of which is the following. Islamophobia is the racism, the stereotypes, the prejudice, the fear or acts of hostility directed towards individual Muslims or followers of Islam in general. In addition to individual acts of intolerance and racial profiling, Islamophobia can lead to viewing and treating Muslims as a greater security threat on an institutional, systemic, and societal level. Now, the trial of the killer in the Afzal attack begins this fall, so we don't yet know all the details, other than he was immersed in the deep web and that he was motivated by hate of Muslims. However, as I said, we do have some information about the Quebec City mosque killer, and what we know was that he left his parents' home armed with 2 semi-automatic weapons on January 29, 2017. He left his home believing that Muslims were a threat to his family and to his community. What was later discovered after reviewing his laptop was that he had immersed himself in websites, Facebook pages, and YouTube videos related to firearms, Muslims, immigrants, and serial killers. He was also obsessively following Twitter postings of Donald Trump with a particular interest in a travel ban the US president had just imposed on 7 Muslim-majority countries. The last straw for him was when he read a tweet from the Prime Minister in response to the so-called Muslim ban that said, quote, "To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. #welcome to Canada." With a head filled with the commentary of right-wing commentators, as well as conspiracy theorists and alt-right and white supremacist neo-Nazi leaders, the scepter of the Muslim other loomed large enough to compel the shooter to act. So why are we surprised? A study released in 2018 by the Washington-based Institute for Social Policy and Understanding found that between 2002 and 2015, the New York Times and the Washington Post gave, on average, 770% more coverage to foiled cases of ideologically motivated violence involving Muslim perpetrators than non-Muslim perpetrators. And between 2008 and 2012, 81% of stories about terrorism on US news programs were about Muslims, while only 6% of domestic terrorism suspects were actually Muslim. And over a 25-year span, Muslims garnered more negative headlines in the New York Times than cocaine, cancer, and alcohol. Laval University professor Colette Bryn said in an interview a year following the Quebec City massacre that within Quebec's media, quote, "There's the fear of Islamic terrorism and then the generalization that the Muslims' Islamic faith in general is the problem. Muslims are constantly under scrutiny, the subject of persistent, divisive political rhetoric, and the subject of fear-mongering. Emile Bruneau, a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania, has been studying how such narratives create divisions within our society and create a climate in which violence appears justifiable. Quote, if you collectively blame an entire group for the actions of individuals, it makes it totally reasonable to exact your revenge from any person from that group. Earlier this spring, Angus Reid published a poll showing that across the country, Canadians are least likely to hold favorable views of Islam than the 5 other major religions. And previous Angus Reid surveys showed that nearly a third of Canadians express a desire for a reduction in Muslim immigration to Canada. Now, as I have been traveling to various communities over the past 3 months of being in office, I've heard from Canadian Muslims who are determined to dispel fears, ignorance, and misinformation about their faith traditions and raise awareness about the positive contributions they make every day. Yet that work is akin to pushing a boulder up a mountain. What none of us are able to fully take on is the impact of our online spaces when it comes to the otherization of various minority communities and the hate-filled responses to reasoned discourse, which has made it very difficult to provide counter-narratives to stem all of this. Dangerous narratives and ideas, including the Great Replacement theory, which suggests that non-white immigration threatens white majorities, are fueling the rage of non-racialized men who have taken it upon themselves to harm, even kill, those who don't look like them. Not only is Islamophobia a common thread among far-right communities, but so is anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and hate targeting sexual minorities. All this creates a toxic mix of antisocial narratives that are further amplified by algorithms that in fact have been designed to platform content that keeps people on social media longer and that often includes content that specifically makes people angry. And as we saw during the pandemic, disparate groups with a variety of grievances will coalesce to advance anti-democratic ideas, again, fueled by anger. 2020 research from the UK-based Institute for Strategic Dialogue think tank identified more than 6,600 online channels, pages, accounts, or groups where Canadians were involved in spreading white supremacist, misogynistic, or other radical views. On some forums, Canadians were found to be highly active, even more on average than users in the US or Britain. Is it any wonder then that 78% of Canadians are concerned about the spread of hate speech online, or that 72% are concerned about growing political polarization, as found in an abacus poll commissioned by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation in 2021? The impacts, again, are significant. A survey this March by Toronto Metropolitan University showed that 72% of Canadians believe they have been exposed to more harmful content, such as hate speech, harassment, and false information over the past few years. And exposure to online hate remains higher amongst marginalized communities. 10% of Canadians reported being targets of online hate speech, and 8% said they were targets of online harassment that caused them to fear for their safety. These proportions were approximately twice as high among Canadians who are racialized, have a disability, or identify as LGBTQ2S+. In the days and weeks following the Quebec City mosque attack, the first such attack at a place of worship on Canadian soil in this country's history, communities came together in solidarity. People of various faiths, or no faiths at all, participated in vigils, held hands in circles of protection around mosques, and demonstrated through actions and words that such attacks on our collective well-being were unacceptable. This did not stop polarization, and in fact, efforts to name Islamophobia were politicized and led to anti-Muslim rallies across the country within weeks of the massacre. What this tells us is that while community solidarity is of incredible importance, not only must it be sustained, but must also engage with political discourse, address underlying grievances, and work cleverly at defending not only our pluralistic democracy, but root such work within an anti-racist mindset that acknowledges systemic racism and supports the rehabilitation of our institutions. With hate on the rise against many minority communities, including a 71% increase in hate targeting Muslims between 2020 and 2021, we must understand such data as representing real and present danger to our democracy. In communities across Canada, polarization is real and sending a frightening message meant to keep communities from participating and contributing and leading to further marginalization and exclusion. And there is no doubt that we must strongly counter divisive voices with narratives of our own about what it means to belong to a country that aspires to values of diversity, freedom, and safety for all. But it won't be easy. Nevertheless, we must work collaboratively to nurture positive narratives from within faith communities and beyond, from a place where our common humanity is valued and is informed by principles of equity, inclusion, and love, and with a determination to effect social change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. I should say, if you're wondering why we keep shuffling back and forth to this table here instead of speaking at the microphones, it's because we are live streaming this and there's a camera over here, so I hope you'll forgive the shuffle. I should also have said at the start, bien que cette discussion sera principalement en anglais, si vous avez soit des questions, soit des commentaires à offrir en français, veuillez s'il vous plaît les faire. Pour moi, j'aurais probablement autant de difficultés à répondre en français en anglais. Our next speaker will be Andrea Salguera, who we all know very well because she opened our discussion. Andrea is a lawyer and most recently had a clerkship at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Costa Rica. She currently serves as Director of the Office of Public Affairs for the Bahá'í Community of Canada. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Akash, for the introduction. This morning, I wanted to focus my remarks on some of the highlights from the Our Whole Society conference, which I thought would help to understand the current landscape of polarization in Canada, and also to understand the role of faith communities in fostering greater respect for differences of perspective and belief. As was mentioned, this year's theme for the Our Whole Society conference was Finding Common Ground in a Time of Polarization. It brought together over 120 individuals, many of them representatives from different faith communities, and really fostered a deeper dialogue on this issue. One key takeaway from the conference was the understanding that the term polarization captures a wide range of social divisions in Canada. Rifts can be rooted in ideological conflict, for instance, in differences in perspectives from the political left or the political right. But it could also include the relationship between vaccinated and unvaccinated people, in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and between religious and secular perspectives, to name a few of the most commonly mentioned examples at the conference. So when we say that polarization is growing in Canada, when we say that these social divisions are deepening, the issues that divide can look different depending on the part of the country where one lives. And this is due to the particular history of a region or to the particular lived experiences of the individuals that are interviewed. For example, in a polarization survey from 2023, lower income Canadians rank the conflict between the rich and the poor as being the most pressing issue of polarization. From the conference, we came to understand that though social issues may vary, polarization deepens in predictable ways. It begins with the othering of another group in word or in deed, and is fed by perspectives that gradually impede seeing the humanity in each other. This in turn affects how people relate to each other in the words they choose to address one another and how they engage with perspectives differing from one's own views. As we already heard today, polarization is not an abstract or a theoretical concept. When influenced by currents of thought that are based in prejudice, they can end up, these social divisions, when left unchecked, can end up promoting hate, which results in tangible harms to individuals and communities. In the most extreme consequences, as Amira shared today, it results in the loss of human life. Now, while polarization is growing in Canada, the Indigenous speakers at this conference also reminded us that efforts to counter polarization cannot be clothed in the nostalgia of a return to a distant past where we did have social harmony in Canada and where everything was fine. Prejudice against Indigenous people in particular has been present since before the inception of Canada and continues to this day. The polarization we see today is perhaps the latest iteration of these deep-seated prejudices that have been lent a stronger voice through the amplification of social media and other technology. So within this landscape, what can faith communities do to counter this deepening polarization in our country? At the conference, we heard a great deal about the importance of fostering spaces for dialogue between people of different perspectives and creating opportunities for people to know one another. I think a space like this morning's event could fall under this category as a meeting place where there's the exchange of ideas that eventually leads to the development of policy. And going a step further, I think the conference also raised that hosting spaces dedicated to prayer, spaces that intentionally foster a connection with the divine, is also something faith communities are able to offer, and that these spaces are a powerful way to counter polarization through the spiritual transformation of individual hearts and minds. Now, this point about the power of prayer was mentioned by MP Elizabeth May in the opening plenary of the conference as something that in her experience directly helps to address polarization. I hope I'm not taking any spoilers from your remarks. Since I heard her share this, I've been thinking about why that is the case. Prayer as a response to polarization can sound simplistic when we're faced with what seem like insurmountable challenges, or not just rifts between people, but what really seem like chasms in terms of perspectives and ways of life. So upon further reflection, I thought that maybe the effect of prayer is due to the spiritual discipline that it creates in us to be able to engage with others. In a state of prayer, according to the teachings of many scriptures, we have the opportunity to focus our minds on something beyond our own limitations and to ask assistance from a divine force of good that helps us turn hate into love, annoyance into patience, and aggression into peace. Through prayer, we're also better able to see the humanity in others through our connection with the divine. And the act of prayer is therefore a direct counter to the dehumanizing process that happens and is inherent to polarization. Since there are many here that are part of faith communities that are already hosting such spaces, it could be that our challenge as faith communities is to ensure that the spaces that we do dedicate to collective prayer or even to community service projects or the many, many ranges of endeavors in which we engage, to ensure that these spaces are welcoming of a wide range of people and of perspectives. I think an added challenge, especially when we think of our whole society, we're also thinking of people who may not identify as being religious, but who still have that longing for a connection and who may find their spirituality outside of traditional religion. And I think our challenge as faith communities is to also be able to engage and bring what we've learned in our own communities to these other spaces as well, to identify aspects that foster a spiritual environment and then to actively bring it into other spaces so that we can all collectively learn about what it means to really foster understanding and social harmony. Some examples that I could think of was the language we use to invite others to our spaces, the way we describe our own activities, to ensure that the language we use is not becoming a barrier to participation. Even something simple like the way that we set up a room to speak for dialogue. I really appreciate that today's room, just not because we particularly arranged it, but we're sitting in a circle, and I think that affects how we're able to see and speak to one another. Also being open to recognizing the sacred in practices other than our own spiritual traditions. And I think in this regard, there's a lot to learn from our Indigenous friends that do introduce a sacredness into every meeting space when they're invited. For instance, when we invite an elder into into what would otherwise be a traditionally secular space. So that's my time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Our third speaker will be Richard Marceau. Richard is the former Member of Parliament for the federal riding of Charlesbourg. He was the Bloc Québécois critic for a number of portfolios, including the Privy Council and Justice, and he achieved the improbable feat of passing a private member's bill, the bill that brought into being Canada's National Holocaust Memorial Day Act. He is currently the Vice President, External and General Counsel for the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to see so many friends and new friends here today. In a democracy, it is essential to be able to disagree, to talk, and disagreeing does not mean to be polarized. Sometimes discussions can be heated and must be heated because Parliament and parliamentarians deal with very important issues. So when we try to overcome polarization, we must make sure that we're not trying to get rid of differences in a democracy. But there are ways to do this. We have to, first of all, get to know each other better. And that means to listen to one another, to talk with or to talk to, and not talk at one another. Judaism is a religion of listening. The central prayer in Judaism is the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Listen, Israel, the Lord is one, our Lord is one. The word lishmoa, to listen in Hebrew, appears 92 times in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy. And in fact, it's not really translatable in English. We say to listen, but it also means to heed, to pay attention. So in fact, I would argue that one of the main Jewish contribution to civilization, to the world, is the concept of listening. We have representatives today of many faith traditions, and religion has hard hedges because we're dealing with truth. And because we come from different religious traditions, it means that we would disagree on fundamental truths. But it has to be done with respect, and Akash and other people of the Canadian Interfaith Coalition show how it can be done. Even when we're dealing with fundamental truth, it can be done with respect. And I would argue with some of the people who say that religion brings problems in the world because it divides people. I would say when you look into this room, that's the exact opposite. Because when you have respect, when you're secure in your faith tradition, when you're secure in your beliefs, and you respect the other, being people of faith, being people whose worldviews are informed one way or another by faith, it brings people together. And I would say that one of the divides now that we're seeing in Canadian society is between people who have worldviews that are informed by their faith and people who reject that point of view. So here, people in this room, we have an important work to do, to show that diversity, including religious diversity, can be managed in a respectful manner. Second point I want to make is polarization oftentimes creates victims. And Amira spoke very poignantly about some of the problems that are facing the Muslim communities, and Islamophobia killed in Canada. People were targeted by their faith, and they were killed because they were Muslims. Many other people are also targeted because of their faith. A few words about anti-Semitism in Canada, because I believe that anti-Semitism, when a society is polarized, when a society has some issues, oftentimes the Jews are the targets of hate. And we see that according to Statistics Canada, year after year, the Jews are the most targeted religious community in Canada. And I'm not saying that to play victimhood Olympics, because that's not the way we do things here in Canada. But anti-Semitism as Islamophobia is on the rise. And Jews are now targeted both as individuals, as Jews, and as a collective, either as a community or for example, as supporters of the State of Israel. So what can we do against anti-Semitism? Listen to the Jewish community when they say there's an issue. Hear what the Jewish community, consider as anti-Semitism. Hear us when we say it's anti-Semitic. And I would use that time that I have to call on Parliament to introduce very quickly a legislation to target online hate. Because this is one of the reasons why hate is spreading in Canada and around the world, why we're becoming polarized. The government has committed to introducing legislation back in 2019. We are now in June 2023. Hate does not wait. Third point and last point I want to make. A Canada that is safer and better for Jews is a Canada that is better and safer for Sikh, for Muslims, for Christians, for Hindus, for LGBTQ2 people, for Asian Canadians and Black Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians, Indigenous peoples. A Canada that is safer and better for Hindus is better and safer for Jews, for Muslim, for Sikhs, for Indigenous Black communities. And you know where I'm going with this. We are all in this together, and so we must be there for one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Now that we've heard from our opening speakers, Amira, Andrea, and Richard, we will be hearing from three parliamentarians, members of the all-party Parliamentary Interfaith Caucus. I think we all know the cliche that it is dangerous to talk about politics or religion. The MPs who are members of the all-party Parliamentary Interfaith Caucus have shown their courage in being willing to talk about both and in combining them. Before I invite them up one at a time, I do want to acknowledge our gratitude to them, both for forming this group, but I think more importantly, for doing so across party lines. We are keenly aware as Canadians that an element of polarization that is both a cause and consequence of social polarization has been a rise in hyperpartisanship and an inability of people from different political traditions, or an unwillingness of people from different political traditions to join hands with one another in pursuit of the national interest. I do, as a result, want to commend the members of Parliament who have formed the all-party parliamentary group for their willingness not only to pursue such an important issue, which is in addition to their more conventional duties as parliamentarians, but their willingness to do so across party lines. I think that in addition to the personal contributions that they have made on this subject, they have modelled depolarization through their conduct and willingness to stand together rather than standing against one another. Our first speaker will be Garnet Genuis, who is a long-time member of the all-party Parliamentary Interfaith Caucus. He is the Member of Parliament for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, and in 2016, he was the youngest Member of Parliament to be named Maclean's Parliamentarian of the Year in a vote of his peers at the tender and, dare I say, babyish age of, I think, 30. He is the Shadow Minister for International Development.
Well, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be able to share a few reflections on the problem of political polarization and to respond to some of the excellent talks we've heard this morning. I think we have to be very careful with how we use the term, because polarization seems to be one of those pejorative labels that gets thrown around liberally, always without clear or precise definition. In that sense, I think some people would be surprised that I'm here presenting, asking me to talk about political polarization. Some people's mind is that like asking WestJet to speak about punctuality or something. But I would say that the fact that people take different positions on issues, have divergent worldviews that they debate sharply, or seek to hold each other accountable for failures in politics, these things might, on some readings, be defined as a kind of polarization, but they are actually a natural and necessary part of a healthy functioning democracy. A healthy democracy is one in which leaders defend principled positions and offer clear contrasts with each other. And the criticism that a person is contributing to polarization is often the equivalent of saying that they're expressing a view outside of a particular prevailing consensus, but a democratic process requires that. I would also say that the debate around polarization is sometimes itself subject to polarization. As a conservative, I would love to be able to get up here and say that polarization is bad and it's all Justin Trudeau's fault. I'm sure. I'm sure. I may have said that, in fact, on a few occasions. And if I were to do that, I would be both discussing and contributing to polarization at the same time. So I think polarization is a problem. We need to critique it, but we need to be precise in our critique. And I think there was some very good discussion this morning about extreme polarization leading to violence and being borne out by a kind of hiving off of different spaces where people are in places where they're not hearing their views contradicted, and I think that can happen in a lot of different ways, and it can lead to violence when there is absolutely no intercourse or interaction with people that are being demonized in one space. Contributes to otherization. I think it can happen in other ways that are also dehumanizing. And when you have these instances of extreme violence, I think you have an extreme that's doing it, and then you have kind of a large swath of people that, because of aspects of polarization, have become indifferent to it. I'll share a personal story and something we haven't talked about, which is the violence that's targeted the Catholic community, especially in Western Canada last summer. And I remember waking up and hearing that this beautiful historic church had been burned to the ground about an hour from where I live, and it's in the middle of the town of Morinville, and quite dangerous to human life. It was a historic, important building that was destroyed, but it was near an apartment building, and it wasn't inevitable that no lives would be lost in that destruction. So I was very personally affected by this. I drove out and spoke to some of the people that had happened there, and then just reading the official reactions from this place, from here, official Ottawa, where I spent a lot of time, and realized that actually very few people cared, because there was a rush to contextualize this kind of thing, to say it was as one very prominent person in this country shamefully said, it was wrong but understandable that these things were happening. I think that's a product of polarization. That me being in a space as a practicing Catholic, and where an event like this is very personally affecting, but then realizing that there are swaths of other people who don't care. And I think in instances of violence targeting the Jewish community, Muslim community, other communities, people would identify with similar types of events. So I think dehumanization is sort of the central problem that we see that is part of the problem of polarization we want to critique. Many of our faith traditions teach that human dignity is inherent in the person. One consequence of believing in inherent human dignity is that the person is not defined primarily by identity markers, by experiences, or by political opinions. I have various characteristics, experiences, beliefs, but as a human being, I am not just the sum of those parts. Prior to any of those things, I am a creature created with inherent and limitless value because I am made in the image of God. This humanism, grounded in faith, is the basis of a lot of the human rights work I do, and I think of the predominant doctrines of human rights in general, universal humanism. But there's an increasingly prominent alternative view. That alternative view sees people as fundamentally defined by their characteristics without some indivisible soul underneath. Now, if you subscribe to that kind of former inherent human dignity view, then you can appreciate how we all share a common humanity in spite of differences in views and characteristics. Therefore, if somebody has nothing in common with you otherwise, they still have that most essential piece in common as a human being. But if you subscribe to the alternative view and see the human person as merely a combination of material characteristics and experiences, then there's nothing that binds you or that you share with someone who is not part of your social or political group. So polarization in this sense, I think, is the growing phenomenon of seeing each other as a series of opinions or identity markers instead of as human beings. This approach overstates the importance of political beliefs or identity markers and understates the importance of our common humanity. I think a contributor to this problem is ever-increasing emotivism, which characterizes our politics. So emotivism is the idea that a person's judgments about political or ethical issues are an expression of personal feelings or preferences instead of rationally derived assertions about objective truth. With emotivism so dominant in practice, saying that I disagree with someone is often read as a personal attack on them. If we see views as being necessary extensions of persons, then we cannot attack someone's views without attacking their person. But a functioning democracy which minimizes polarization and promotes collegiality would be one in which we can attack each other's views without attacking each other. Again, this requires an appreciation of the inherent human core that lies underneath our views, experiences, and identity markers. And I want to just identify one additional aspect of polarization that I see as very important to us in practice as parliamentarians. So at one time it would have been the case that many of us came into politics with strong grounding in some external non-political community. Our values were shaped principally not by our political associations, such as conservative or liberal, but by prior non-political associations, such as Catholic or Muslim or Jewish or part of an indigenous community, etc. These prior associations are an antidote to polarization because they hold us back from being too narrowly connected to our political identities. I quite enjoyed reading Jody Wilson-Raybould's book, Indian in the Cabinet, and she describes her deep connection to the practices and ideals of her Indigenous community. Her pre-political commitments kept her from being too partisan and therefore led her to stand against her party when her conscience in the political context called for it. The discussion of her actions in sort of the mainstream media has highlighted her own personal courage in certain instances, but has often missed, I think, the way that her membership in a strong community of shared values made her less dependent on the pseudo-community associated with being part of a political party. So I think polarization today is driven by the fact that many in politics are no longer connected to pre-political communities. Politics is all they have. There is nothing to check or moderate their devotion to their chosen ideology or political group. So polarization happens when our identities are unidimensional, and especially when they are narrowly political. It is checked when we have other identities or connections that shape and constrain our commitment to political parties, when we see ourselves as both part of a faith community and part of a political community and part of a neighborhood and part of Canada, part of multiple overlapping identity groups. So I see polarization as the manifestation of many other kinds of problems that we see: a decline of authentic humanism, the rise of emotivism, the decline of community, and I think we need to find ways of working on all of these problems together, and I think an interfaith caucus like this is a great place to do it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Guy. That was interesting. There's so much I'd like to say, but I really shouldn't. But that was a very rich contribution. Thank you. Our next speaker is Elizabeth May. She's the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, and her background in environmentalism and in the NGO sector is too broad and varied and well known for me to go through. But I'll simply mention that she is, amongst other things, the founding executive director of the Sierra Club of Canada before entering politics, and she is now co-leader of the Green Party of Canada.
Thank you, Akash. And thanks to everyone for being here this morning. I want to say this is not an early hour in Ottawa. The early hour is our weekly Wednesday morning prayer breakfast at 7 a.m., which some of us attend fairly regularly. And it keeps me going, I can tell you that. We don't agree on much else, but I will say that my friends, who are my dear family with whom I pray on Wednesday mornings, keep me going. They may want to reconsider praying with me when we consider all the other aspects of our friendships. I also want to say, because I was teasing Garnet earlier, and I realized that might be taken out of context. People might think that I actually am poking him with a stick about polarization. I love Garnet so much, and he knows it. And we had a wonderful faith experience. We celebrated Easter together once in a Catholic Mass entirely in Arabic in Bethlehem. We were able to keep up with the basic liturgy. We knew the pattern, and we got the Hosanna. We knew what that was, and there were a few hallelujahs and amen we could follow. But it's important, and I think Garnet made a very profound point there, that we have a community outside of politics. That's a pretty dangerous place to be if all you have is politics. I also want to say that the talk I gave, and it was an honor to be a speaker at the Faith Conversation, but it was completely accidental. You were supposed to hear from Kathleen Wynne, and she had to cancel at almost the last minute. So I got a call, believe it or not, on Good Friday, where I usually have was an email, and I shouldn't have been looking at emails at all on Good Friday, but anyway, I did. And I ended up saying, well, I think I can fit in getting to Waterloo. What I talked about there was try to convert rage farming to love farming. We have not just an accidental rise in hatred, we have a manipulated rise in hatred, and it's for a profit motive for some very large multinationals that figure out the algorithms that drive people to their sites, that allow them to harvest our private information and sell it. So we need to pay some attention to what's going on in terms of, and thank you, Richard, for calling it out, online hate. I want to take a slightly different lens to this, and then, believe it or not, I'm going to be dashing out of here because we have the I won't leave before Samir speaks, but I will leave rather hastily for the raising of the pride flag in front of Parliament Hill. When you look at these incidents as who is the victim here, you end up with different categories of hate. You end up with Islamophobia, you end up with anti-Semitism, you end up with misogyny, you end up with anti-Indigenous racism. And when you take a lens with this, you think, well, there can't be anything much in common between someone who gets behind the wheel of a car and runs down a family in London, Ontario, and somebody who gets a gun and walks into École Polytechnique. What made me really pay attention to a different perspective on this was an event on June 28th, 2022 that happened in my own riding. And it was reported, you probably heard about it, but might not have paid much attention to it as a hate incident. It was reported as a bank robbery. Does it ring any bells? In Saanich, a very small branch of the Bank of Montreal in my riding. And the intended target was the police. The only two people killed were brothers, Matthew and Isaac Ochterlony, who grew up unremarkably in Duncan, British Columbia, a lovely place. They were two out of triplets. Their sister wasn't involved in what occurred, but they had been spending quite a lot of time buying guns, immersing themselves, and just as Amira was saying about the people who took the lives of Muslim Canadians in the two incidents she related, they were about the same age and put themselves in the same frame of deep engagement in a dark community online. Matthew and Isaac decided to take every penny they could save. They were 22 years old. They decided to take all the money they could save and put it into buying guns, buying camouflage and warlike materials and body armor, and they also had some explosives. So if you look at that and you look at the Incel Toronto van event, right, where that was April 23rd, 2018, 10 people were killed by a young man who hated women. If you take out the targets for a moment, which get siloed into different kinds of hate, and for a moment look at the rise in hate in terms of who are the actors and how are they targeted, I think if we could apply ourselves as people of faith who are called upon to be compassionate, to love, and figure out what's happening to young white men around 22 to 26 years old, who's targeting them and drawing them into a world where it's easier to other people, where it's easier to hate people? Are they abandoned? Are they lost? What's happening to them? It started hitting me because right after I read 22-year-old Matthew and Isaac Octoloni, it was within the same time frame that I read 22-year-old white man in a mall in Denmark, 22-year-old white man all around the world. So what's happening there? And if they are targeted by rage farming, yes, we can shut down online hate, and it's actually relatively easy to do if we could get governments all around the world to decide that there's no such thing as a platform. There are only publishers. And once we decide that Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these places are publishers, we don't need to try to regulate this because governments are particularly bad at trying to regulate who gets protected from hate. But we can, because there's a huge body of law around slander and libel and hate speech, and you can't publish it or you're going to get sued. So the big online people that are making money out of this would lose that profit incentive. Anyway, when I look at all of this, and I look at the injunctions that come to us from every major faith tradition, whether Sikh or Hindu or Christian or Jew or Islamic, and indeed, thank you for raising the indigenous ontology of abundance, which permeates all indigenous traditions, of a real love of Mother Earth and a respect for each other, and even a respect in the culture and traditions of the Wasanic people whose territory I'm honored to represent here, that includes not just the whales and the trees and the salmon, but also the rocks and the islands. All of the traditions that call on us to know that we are not the only thing there is, that there's something bigger than us, however we describe it. I describe it as Jesus Christ and the Lord, but I'm totally all-encompassing for however anybody else is going to describe it, as long as it lets us remember that we're responsible for our own actions and that we have to act in love. And if we're not acting with love as the number one thing that carries us through the day, we're in trouble. And with that, I will close and say I do love these poor folks who are being targeted, who happen to be very, very angry young white men, whether what motivates them is that they hate indigenous people or they hate, I was going to say, you never hear a news story of, 65-year-old indigenous woman armed to the teeth goes forward and kills people. You never hear the story of elderly white feminist decides to take them out. There's a kind of a category that we're not looking at here. And I think we need to look at the people who get killed by the police when they go forward for death by cop, as the Octoloni brothers did, as victims too, and figure out how to rescue them through love. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I find myself wondering whether after your Easter with Garnett, it might have taken one of you 3 days to rise again.
Yeah.
You.
We didn't drink that much. A little bit. Yeah.
Well, we had to break plan.
Moving along. Our final speaker is Samir Zuberi. He is the Member of Parliament for Pierrefonds-Dollard. He was, as a student, extremely active in student affairs and student politics, and he was the first recipient of the Juanita Westmoreland Traore Scholarship for his work in social justice and equality. He is currently, amongst his other roles in Parliament, Chair of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Samir.
Bonjour. Do I choose a mic? Do I choose a mic? Probably. Bonjour, c'est un plaisir de voir tout le monde ici ce matin. This morning, bright and early in Ottawa. It's great to see everybody here. I gotta speak up. I'm a low talker. Even with a microphone, people can't always hear me. I'm getting signals in the back saying it's important to raise my voice a bit. I want to thank Akash, thank you, and Andrea for organizing us, bringing us together. Such a diverse background of people from many, many different faiths, and usually we think about few faith traditions gathering together, but I can see that there are many, many different faith traditions here represented around the table, and that is a beautiful thing, that we can come together early in the morning, waking up after a late night, and still gather around this table to have a conversation. And conversations are so important. They are critical. That where we can be able to speak with each other, be able to listen to each other, which is actually the harder thing to do. And I would say, dare I say, go a mile in each other's shoes, to have the courage, strength, and empathy in order to do that. That isn't an easy thing, but that is something that I would suggest all of us in this room, we must do. It is something that allows us to navigate challenging conversations and allows us to be better advocates for what we hold dear. And at the end of the day, we are all united here by core values for the respect of every person on the face of this earth. For we understand that each and every person, whatever one's background, whatever one's orientation, whoever they love, care for, deserves basic dignity and respect. We know that. More than that, we know that we have to build a society that is one, where we can be together, where everybody has their space and can be their true selves as they understand it. And that's why I think that this gathering is so important and so unique, that we have people of so many different backgrounds here. I'd like to pick up on some comments and listening to those who came before me. There was a reference to what some faith traditions call the Holy Land. And I've been to Jerusalem. It's, people ask me, what's the city, the city that you most liked, that you've traveled to? And I've been to Europe, I've been to North Africa, Asia, many of us in America and Central America. But the most beautiful city I've ever traveled to has been thus far Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a spectacular city. It's a city that has been a living city for millennia. It's been a city that has been governed by seven different exchange hands 7 different times over its history. It's a city that brings together different faith traditions, all seeking the same thing in their unique paths, crisscrossing, overlapping, with phones ringing, and news also, be it BBC, be it other news agencies, Haaretz, others. And along with their spirituality is the news situation, and the two mix and mingle, and they do coexist. And what I noticed there after going there through a bridge building program, and I'll share a bit myself. I have Christians and Jews in my family. My first cousins are Jewish. My aunt married a Jewish man as a sincere Jew, and I went to Jerusalem through a bridge building program between Muslims and Jews, and I did so to in part understand my family, in part because I did want to go to this beautiful city. And what I noticed there were different traditions crisscrossing. What I did notice was that there was a desperate need for something like this room, thickening the middle space to bring people together who are believing in core values, and we all believe in core values, but really thinking about those core values, pondering upon them, and developing and thickening them. And for us to, gather together in order to do that. This is something I think that we need to remind ourselves about. It's something we need to work hard for. It's something that's not easy to do. It's something that takes courage. Courage because you are leaning into conversations. Courage because you might have people who might be similar to you critiquing what you do. I think what was mentioned earlier from Elizabeth around around social media is important. We are right now, our lives are seen through the prism and lens of social media. We spend hours on our phone, and I get updates every week telling me how many hours on average a day I spend on my phone. Obviously, I'm not fully attentive to it, but it's operating in the background, okay? Oftentimes we're multitasking. And we all know how many hours we're spending on our phone. So a lot of that is through the prism of social media. And what is social media but a way to see updates from our friends? FOMO, fear of missing out. It is also an echo chamber based upon an algorithm of what we spend time on, even if we don't like or click. Social media knows and measures that we have taken, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 3 seconds, flipped. It knows. It then sends us more information based upon that. Keeps us in our echo chambers. We need to consciously understand that's what's happening to our society. And that is the opposite of bridge building. The opposite of clasping hands, coming together. It's something I think we do need to have a conversation of within our society. I don't want to take up more time because I know that it's always challenging to hear many different people speak. But I do want to just underscore how important this gathering is and how we need to reproduce this. And I ask that we continue to remember, in addition to the importance of bridge building, that we approach the world with empathy, do our best to understand, do our best to contribute to the bridge building process, and be careful to not promote populism, because that does divide people. And I'm eager to hear what others have to say in this room. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. And that brings us to the close of the formal part of our proceedings, although I would encourage everyone to stay around and interact with one another, speak with one another, and to meet one another. I do wish to once again thank our speakers, Amira, Andrea, and Richard, Garnett, Elizabeth, and Samir for their contributions. I'm struck by Garnett's observation that for all of our differences, we all share a common humanity and a common spark of the divine. Elizabeth's view that we have to be prepared as individuals to recognize that hate makes victims of us all, including those who hate, and that the antidote is to love those who hate us. And Samir's observation of the power and importance of listening to one another and seeking to understand the differences that can be a source of strength rather than of weakness. And it does strike me that for all of the diverse faith traditions that are represented in this room, I think it's true that all of us hold to the idea that whether we believe in the existence of a personal God or not, we all feel that we are all in our way the same imperfect children of the same perfect providence, trying to find our way back to grace. And in that regard, there is a call to humility as well as of understanding that has bound us together. I would also like to thank the organizers at the Canadian Interfaith Conversation who have made today possible. Andrea, Richard Chambers, who is not able to be with us, he's based in Toronto, the volunteer board, and in particular the members of staff of the members of Parliament who are here today. I think anyone who's had any exposure to politics knows that political staffers are the unsung heroes of the political process. So thank you very much. And most of all, and finally, I would like to thank all of you who have taken time to be here today, whether in person or online. You have taken, in many ways, some of the most valuable thing any of us has in these harried days is our time. And you have chosen to invest some of your time to be here, to listen to one another and to share your views. And I think that ultimately is the single greatest antidote to polarization. It is building a society where we can disagree with one another without becoming disagreeable towards one another, and where we value each other precisely because we have a variety of gifts and bring a variety of perspectives, which necessarily means that we draw a variety of conclusions, but we can be stronger together, not in spite of that, but precisely because of that. Thank you to all of you for your contributions here. And once again, I encourage you to stay and join hands informally as you have joined hands formally today. And thank you for being here.